I have worked in interstellar diplomacy for 42 years. In that time, I have negotiated 17 trade agreements, mediated 9 border disputes, survived 2 assassination attempts, and once accidentally started a minor war because I used the wrong color ink on a treaty document. Purple means friendship on Velthar. On Draxis 4, it means you are declaring the signatory's grandmother an enemy of the state. I apologized extensively. We sorted it out. I say all of this so you understand. I am not someone who is easily surprised by what beings do in the name of politics. The humans surprised me. Specifically, what surprised me was not what they did when the Karovian Empire declared war on them. It was what they did not do. What they did not do was panic. What they did not do was mobilize. What they did not do was respond in any way that suggested they had noticed a fleet of 300 warships was currently crossing the outer rim headed directly toward their home system. What they did was file a form. I am going to tell you the story of the Karovian War. I was there for most of it. I have the documentation to prove it. 17 folders, 2 data drives, and a collection of human paperwork that I still do not fully understand despite having studied it for 3 years. The war lasted 4 months. The paperwork lasted longer. Let me begin at the beginning. The Karovian Empire was one of the older powers in the known galaxy. 11,000 years of continuous civilization. 43 star systems under direct imperial control, a military tradition so deeply embedded in their culture that their word for greeting and their word for threat assessment are the same words spoken at different volumes. They were very impressive. They declared war on Earth on a Tuesday. Not Earth's Tuesday, their Tuesday. Humans have their own name for it, and I have given up trying to reconcile the 2 calendar systems. The point is, it was a Tuesday for someone. Eighth delivered it personally from the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal. The declaration was, by all accounts, magnificent. Supreme Warlord Karath, the Dominion, a vessel so large it generates its own weather system in the forward cargo bays. He wore the ceremonial armor of the Karovian warrior kings. He was flanked by 100 elite guards. The declaration was transmitted on all frequencies in 63 languages, accompanied by the Karovian Imperial War. Hymn, which is a 27-minute composition involving an orchestra of 400 instruments and a choir of 1,000. It was genuinely an impressive production. I have a recording. I have watched it several times. Even knowing how the story ends, I find it impressive. The man had presence. You cannot take that away from him. The declaration listed 11 specific grievances against humanity. Human colony, ships entering contested space, human mining operations in disputed asteroid, fields, human diplomatic personnel arriving uninvited to 3 separate Karovian state functions, and apparently eating a significant quantity of food intended for the ceremonial post-declaration banquet at one of them. That last one I found particularly specific. Someone was still upset about the banquet. The transmission reached Earth approximately 6 hours after it was sent. Given the distance involved, the Karovians had timed it so the declaration would arrive during what humans call the morning, the theory being that a species receives alarming news better when they have had time to wake up. This was thoughtful. I noted it in my report as an example of Karovian consideration for enemy cultural norms. The human response arrived 11 days later. I was in my office on the Concordance station when the human response was forwarded to my desk. I want to be precise about the timeline. 11 days. The Karovians had sent a war declaration broadcast across 63 languages with a 27-minute orchestral accompaniment. They had 300 warships already in motion. Their forward scouts were visible on long-range sensors. The humans took 11 days to respond. I opened the message. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledged receipt of the communication and thanked the Karovian Empire for using the standard interstellar diplomatic channels rather than the emergency frequency, which was noted as being reserved for genuine crises and should not be used for routine correspondence. Routine. The second paragraph noted that the specific grievances listed in items 1 through 9 were currently under review by the Colonial Boundary Commission, whose next scheduled meeting was in 4 months, and that items 10 and 11 The banquet incidents had been forwarded to the Department of Diplomatic Conduct for assessment. The third paragraph informed Supreme Warlord Karoth VIII that the Office of Interstellar Relations would respond to his declaration within the standard processing window of 30 to 60 business days, and that if he had not received a response within that time, he should contact their office directly, using the reference number provided. There was a reference number. I read the message 4 times, then I sent an urgent communication to my superior at the Velthari Foreign Ministry. Something is wrong with the humans. My superior sent back a one-line response. Define wrong. The Karovian fleet continued toward human space. Supreme Warlord Karoth, to his credit, was not deterred by the administrative response. He had been in the business of conquest for 30 years. He had heard every stalling tactic. He recognized a delay when he saw one, and he was not going to be delayed. He sent a second communication, shorter than the first, more direct. It said, "We are coming. You have 30 days to surrender or face the consequences." The human response arrived in 3 days this time. Progress I noted in my report. The response acknowledged his communication, assigned it a new reference number, and informed him that his deadline request had been flagged for expedited processing. The standard expedited processing window was 15 to 20 business days. They apologized for any inconvenience. There was a survey at the bottom asking him to rate his experience with the Office of Interstellar Relations on a scale of 1 to 5. I have the document. I keep it framed above my desk. At this point, my colleagues at the Velthari Foreign Ministry began to express concern. Not about the war, about the humans. Are they functional? My superior asked me during an emergency briefing. Do they understand what is happening? I reviewed everything I had. Human news broadcasts from the period. Their internal communications that we had access to through standard intelligence channels. Their public response to the declaration. The humans understood what was happening. I found a news segment from Earth's primary broadcast network. The anchor spent 45 seconds on the Karovian declaration, sandwiched between a story about a weather system and a segment about a competition involving baked goods. She described the Karovian Empire as a regional power making territorial claims, and said authorities had confirmed it was being handled through appropriate channels. Appropriate channels. A fleet of 300 warships. Appropriate channels. My colleague at the Velthari Intelligence Division, a woman named Senna who had spent 15 years studying human behavior and still claimed to find it bewildering, sent me a report at this point that I believe explains a great deal. The report was titled, "Why Humans Are Not Panicking, a Working Theory." Senna had been doing what intelligence analysts do, looking at the data, looking beneath the data, and then looking at what the data was trying to hide. What she found was this. The Karovian Empire had, in preparing their declaration of war, reviewed what they called humanity's military capability assessment. This assessment noted that humanity maintained a modest defensive fleet, several orbital platforms, and ground-based defense systems. Standard for a species of their development. Level. Nothing remarkable, nothing threatening. The assessment was accurate. It was also, Senna noted in her report, about 15 years out of date. Because what the Karovian assessment had not accounted for, what almost no one had accounted for, was what humanity had been doing with the past 15 years. Senna pulled the shipping manifests, the construction records, the personnel, files, the energy consumption data for human space over the preceding decade and a half. She found discrepancies, significant discrepancies, the kind of discrepancies you find when a species has been building something large and has been very quiet about it. She sent me a single image with her report, a sensor sweep of what appeared to be empty space at the outer edge of human territory. At standard resolution, nothing. At enhanced resolution with the right filters in the right spectrum, ships, hundreds of them, dark, running cold, no emissions, sitting in the dark, between the stars like they had been there for a very long time and were very comfortable waiting. I forwarded the image to my superior. My superior forwarded it to the foreign minister. The foreign minister forwarded it to the Prime Council. Everyone forwarded it, and nobody wanted to be the one to decide what it meant. Meanwhile, the Karovian fleet crossed into what they considered to be the border of human space. The human response was immediate. They sent a form. The form was an infringement notice. Specifically, it was a notice of unauthorized transit through designated human colonial space, Form IR 7742C, which apparently existed as a standard document used when vessels entered human claimed territory without filing the appropriate flight plan through the Colonial Navigation Authority. 300 warships had crossed the border. They each received their own individual form, IR 7742C, with their own individual reference number. 300 separate reference numbers. The Karovian Fleet Communications Officer who received the first batch, and I, have spoken to this officer in the years since. He was very cooperative during the post-war assessment period, told me that he stared at his screen for approximately 4 minutes before reporting to the Supreme Warlord. "What did you tell him?" I asked. He said, "Sir, the humans have fined us for trespassing." Supreme Warlord Kareth asked how much the fine was. The officer calculated the total across 300 vessels. The Supreme Warlord did not laugh. He was not that kind of man. But I am told that 2 of his senior officers had to briefly leave the bridge. The Karovian fleet continued its advance. They had come too far to be stopped by paperwork. The Supreme Warlord issued a formal rejection of all 300 forms, stamped them with his personal seal of imperial authority, and transmitted them back to the Human Colonial Navigation Authority. The Colonial Navigation Authority acknowledged receipt, assigned the rejection A reference number, and informed him that rejected infringement notices were subject to appeal through the standard interstellar arbitration process, which had a current processing backlog of approximately 2 years. They asked if he would like to be added to the arbitration waitlist. He said yes. I do not know why he said yes. I have thought about it many times. My best theory is that by this point he was operating somewhat on autopilot, and the question caught him off guard. He is on the wait list. As far as I know, he is still on it. The Karovian fleet reached the first human colony system 14 days after crossing the border. They expected resistance. They expected an emergency. Defense fleet hastily assembled, outgunned but present. They expected broadcasts from planetary leaders begging for terms. They expected the performance of a species that understood it was about to lose. What they found was a traffic management system. The Colonial Navigation Authority, the same office that had been sending the forms, maintained automated guidance beacons throughout human colonial space. When the Karovian fleet entered the system, the beacons activated. They began directing the fleet, politely, professionally, informing them that military vessels of their classification should proceed to holding coordinates 77 Alpha and maintain position while their transit authorization was processed. Supreme Warlord Kareth had 300 warships. He sat in holding coordinates 77 Alpha for 6 hours. I'm not saying he followed the instructions willingly. The records indicate he did not. The records indicate he ordered his fleet to break formation and proceed to the planet multiple times during those 6 hours. But the automated system kept sending updated navigation advisories. Politely, professionally, updating his position in the processing queue. He was number 47 when he arrived. He was number 31 after 6 hours. He was number 12 when the human fleet appeared. Not from the direction he was watching, from behind. All those dark ships, the ones Senna had found sitting cold in the empty space between the stars, had been moving, quietly, patiently, for 14 days while the Karovians crossed into human territory. The human fleet had been repositioning, not blocking the Karovians, surrounding them. It was not an aggressive maneuver. The human ships did not power weapons. They did not broadcast threats. They simply arrived, in every direction, filling in the space around the Karovian fleet with the quiet certainty of beings who had been planning this specific moment for a very long time. Then the human fleet sent a message. It was from the Office of Interstellar Relations. It informed Supreme Warlord Karath that his case had been elevated to priority processing status due to the extended duration of his inquiry. A senior representative was available to discuss his concerns at his earliest convenience. There was a reference number. Supreme Warlord Karath VIII, commander of the Karovian Imperial Fleet, veteran of 30 years of conquest, wearer of the ceremonial armor of the warrior. Kings looked at his tactical display. 300 ships, surrounded. He opened the communication channel. He said, "I would like to speak to a senior representative." The representative's name was Director Yuan. She was a small woman with gray hair and reading glasses that she kept pushing up her nose. She appeared on the communication screen from what looked like a very normal office with documents, stacked in organized piles on every surface. She had, the Karovians later established, been the director of the Office of Interstellar Relations for 19 years. She was the person who had designed Form IR 742C. Supreme Warlord Karath introduced himself, his title, his lineage. The 30 years of conquest. The 43 star systems, the fleet of 300. Ships currently surrounding, and he gestured, her people. Director Yuan listened to all of this. She said, "Yes, I have your file here." She said it the way someone says it when they have genuinely pulled up a file and are genuinely looking at it. Not a performance, not a power move. She had his file. She had his file since day one. Every communication, every rejected form, every updated reference number, filed, organized, cross-referenced. She said, "I see you have some concerns about colonial boundary designations in Sectors 7 through 12. She said it the way a doctor says, "I see you have been having some discomfort." Clinical, attentive, completely in control of the framing of the conversation. He said, "I declared war on you." She said, "Yes, I have that here too." She pulled out a document. It was, I was later told, his original declaration, printed, filed, with a sticky note on it. He said, "I have 300 warships." She said, "Yes, and I do want to address the transit violations at some point, but perhaps we should start with the underlying territorial dispute since that seems to be the root cause." She pushed her glasses up. She said, "Now, regarding sectors 7 through 12, he surrendered at this point, not formally, not immediately. These things take time. But I have read the transcripts of that meeting many times, and there is a moment, about 40 minutes in, where something changes in his voice." She had been taking notes the entire time, organizing, clarifying, asking him to confirm specific details for the record. For the record, he had come to conquer a planet. She was making sure everything was properly documented. There is a moment where he asks her quietly if any of this was going to result in a resolution, if there was an actual outcome available here. She said yes. She said there were several possible outcomes depending on which process they pursued, and she laid them out in order of likely processing time, fastest to slowest. He asked which one was fastest. She said a bilateral territorial agreement with standard review. About 8 weeks. He said 8 weeks. She said, "We can expedite if both parties agree to mediation." He said, "How long is expedited?" She said 6 weeks. There was a long silence. He signed the mediation agreement. The Karovian fleet withdrew to neutral coordinates to await the mediation process. Supreme Warlord Karath VIII, who had declared war with a 27-minute orchestral accompaniment, departed human space for a scheduled mediation session with the Office of Interstellar Relations. He later described Director Yuan as the most formidable opponent he had ever faced. She sent him a thank you note. It had a reference number. The mediation concluded 6 weeks later as promised. The territorial boundaries in Sectors 7 through 12 were adjusted to acknowledge historical Karovian claims while preserving human colonial rights. A joint commission was established. A trade agreement was drafted. The transit violations were addressed through a negotiated settlement that included a formal acknowledgement from the Karovian Empire and a payment schedule for the outstanding infringement notices. They paid the fines, all 300 of them. I have thought a lot about what humanity did and did not do during those 4 months. I have written 3 separate reports on it for the Velthari Foreign Ministry. I have given lectures. What I keep coming back to is this. The Karovians came with overwhelming force and a magnificent declaration and the absolute certainty that humanity would respond the way every other species responds to overwhelming force, with fear, with urgency, with the desperate scrambling of beings who have suddenly realized their situation. The humans did not scramble. They processed. They had a system. They had forms. They had reference numbers and processing windows and an expedited review option, and a senior representative with glasses and a very organized desk. And behind all of that, quietly, patiently, they had a fleet sitting dark and cold in the space between the stars, waiting for the moment it was needed. The forms were not stalling. The forms were never stalling. The forms were the point. Because while the Karovians were getting increasingly confused and frustrated by the paperwork, the human fleet was moving into position. Bureaucracy as strategy. I asked Director Ewan about this once. After the mediation, we had developed something like a professional relationship. I asked her if the forms were deliberate, if it was planned. She looked at me over her glasses. She said, "The forms are always deliberate." She said, "If someone arrives at your door with bad intentions, the best thing you can do is give them a lot of paperwork to fill out. It keeps their hands busy while you decide what to do." I wrote that down. I have it on my desk next to the framed survey form. Supreme Warlord Karath retired from military command 2 years after the mediation. He was reportedly very thorough in his retirement paperwork. He filed everything correctly, on time, with appropriate reference numbers. Director Ewan sent him a card. I am still, after 42 years in interstellar diplomacy, not entirely sure what to make of humanity. They are patient in ways I find almost alarming. They are organized in ways that I find simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. They have developed paperwork into something that functions, I now believe, as both shield and weapon. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, I am quite certain, there are more. Ships sitting cold and quiet, running no emissions, waiting for someone to cross the wrong border, waiting for the forms to do their job. Do not cross the humans, and if you do, for the love of every god in the galaxy, fill out your forms correctly. End of report. Grex, Cultural Attache, Velthari Imperial Diplomatic Corps, Cycle 889, filed in triplicate with appropriate reference numbers. And if you believe that the pen, or the form, is mightier than the sword, subscribe to Ironheart HFY. We are just getting started.